Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on something that honestly never gets old. I mean, it's thousands of years old, right?
Yeah,
Stoicism. And we all think we kind of know what it is, but there's so much more to it
absolutely
than
not.
just being a statue with no emotions. This is about practical stuff.
Yeah.
Even a guy like Schopenhauer, and he wasn't exactly like Mr. Positive even. He called Stoicism the highest point to which man can attain by the mere use of his faculty of reason.
Yeah, that's high praise coming from him.
Really hardcore.
Yeah. And I think what he was getting at is that it's about practical wisdom.
Okay.
Stoicism isn't just some airy-fairy intellectual thing. It's really a set of tools. Tools for mastering yourself, for developing that grit to persevere, and for, really genuinely becoming wiser in your own life. And that's really what we want to focus on today. How can you actually use this?
Absolutely. And the cool thing is, you're not the first person to go down this path. You're in good company,
Yeah.
right? You got guys like George Washington, Walt Whitman, even Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, too. These were some pretty heavy hitters.
No shortage of those.
And they weren't just, sitting in some ivory tower thinking about this stuff. They were out there leading, making decisions that impacted, thousands, millions of people.
Right. It was in the arena for them.
Absolutely, yeah. So our mission today in this deep dive is really to pull out the essential Stoic principles, the stuff that can help you right now
Yep.
from our sources, and to make sure they have, some immediate practical benefit in your life. We're not going to get lost in who said what year, all that academic stuff.
Yeah.
It's about what can you use starting now.
I like it. Let's
Yeah.
get tactical.
Okay, so where do we begin? I guess one way to start is with what a lot of folks call the big three of Stoic disciplines, right? We've got this idea from Marcus Aurelius about perception, action, will. Now, these aren't just three random ideas floating around, right?
No, not at all. They're really deeply connected. Think about it. How you see things, your perception, that's going to influence the choices that you make, the actions you take. And then to follow through on those actions, you need that inner strength, that resolve. That's the will. And I think a really key takeaway here for you, the listener, is that it's your internal world. It's how you interpret the stuff that happens to you that's under your control, as are your conscious choices and your inner determination.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And when we talk about that inner resolve, it's like modern life is constantly throwing us curveballs. We're surrounded by all these distractions, these little digital breadcrumbs that are meant to pull us off course. Right? Like our sources mention the phantom buzz of the phone. Have you ever had where you think your phone buzzed?
Oh, all the time. But it didn't.
Yeah.
And there's that,
It's Pavlovian.
it's that pull, right? Even when there's nothing there.
Right. And I think that's a perfect illustration of how the environment we're in actually shapes those impulses, those urges. We're living in a world that's, frankly, engineered to be addictive.
Right.
Apps, media, they trigger those same reward pathways in our brains that, drugs might.
Yeah.
You have your news feeds designed to provoke outrage and anxiety, social media that offers that little dopamine hit of validation.
Oh, yeah.
But the core thing here, for you listening, is to recognize that all these things that are kind of engineered to hook you can actually take away your freedom.
Yeah,
Your freedom to choose how you spend your time.
totally.
They cloud your judgment.
Yeah.
They pull you away from what matters. They prevent you from focusing on what's most meaningful.
Totally. It's like we think we're in control just scrolling, but are we?
Right.
This idea of losing the freedom to abstain.
From those compulsions, from those urges, it's a powerful idea. So I think it's worth asking yourself, the listener, what are your addictions? What are those things that you feel like you can't say no to? Maybe it's, that sugary drink. It could be complaining all the time.
Yeah.
Or it might be that internet rabbit hole
Oh, yeah.
that you get sucked into. Could even be a physical thing, like biting your nails.
Right. We all have those things.
But the key here, according to the Stoics, is to reclaim that power.
Absolutely.
To actually step back and say, you know what? I don't have to engage with that right now.
It's that space between stimulus and response.
Right.
And that's where true freedom comes from. And that's where true mental clarity begins.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Now, Marcus Aurelius, he didn't have Twitter, he didn't have Instagram, he didn't have TikTok,
Right.
but he still had distractions, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. He's the emperor. He's got the weight of the Roman Empire on his shoulders. So you have the endless demands of his duties. You have the constant court gossip, his own internal battles with things like fear, desire. I think the lesson for you, the listener, is that it doesn't matter what era you live in, human beings have always had to fight this battle
Right.
against the forces that are trying to control their attention and ultimately their will.
So it's an ancient battle
It is.
that's still being fought today
It is.
in new ways,
Yeah.
but with the same kind of
Underlying dynamics.
underlying mechanics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking about taming these internal and external distractions. But there's this other really interesting point that comes up in our sources about this idea that external things, and this is particularly true for wealth, that if you just get enough of it, it's going to magically fix all of your internal problems.
Yeah, it's such a persistent myth.
It is. But Seneca, as we mentioned, he was a very wealthy guy. And he learned firsthand that money really only changes like the surface level of things, right?
That's right. It doesn't do the deeper work.
It doesn't change who you are.
It can't fill that internal void.
No, it can't.
Yeah.
And yet we keep forgetting this lesson, don't we?
We do over and over.
And then we're surprised when
Disappointed.
we're disappointed that it hasn't fixed everything.
Yeah.
In our sources, there's a great story about F. Scott Fitzgerald being really disillusioned when he realized that rich people weren't some like elevated species.
Right.
And Hemingway just bluntly told him, yeah, they just have more money.
It's so true, though, and it cuts right to the heart of it.
It does.
Right.
It does. So I think the big lesson here for the listener is stop looking outside yourself for that lasting happiness or for the solutions to your inner turmoil. This is an inside job.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a historical thing, right? We see this today. Warren Buffett, I mean, the guy's worth billions, but he still lives in the same relatively modest home that he bought decades ago. John Urschel, the former NFL player, was earning millions and lived really frugally. Kawhi Leonard driving that same beat-up car even after signing these massive contracts.
Right. It's a choice.
It is. It's a statement.
It is.
It is. And it's not just, they're not being eccentric.
No.
They're saying that the things that truly matter to them aren't this stuff.
Exactly. And our sources even make this point that the things that really matter are often the things that are actually, like, cheap in the monetary sense.
It's true.
Right.
It's true. So the takeaway for you, the listener, is that true contentment comes from focusing on those non-material values, on cultivating that inner peace, not from just piling up stuff.
Right.
Okay, so we can't rely on those external fixes.
No.
We need to get a handle on those impulses.
Right.
So how do we actually train ourselves to do this? Epictetus gave us a framework for doing this kind of inner work, didn't he?
He did. He highlighted these 3 really crucial areas to focus on in your personal training. The first one is understanding your desires and aversions.
Right.
What are the things that you should be genuinely striving for? Right.
And what are the things that you should be actively avoiding? And I think the key here is that it's not about blindly following every urge. Because a lot of times our initial impulses lead us astray.
Yeah, right.
It's about consciously evaluating, what actually lines up with a good life and what's ultimately going to cause me harm.
Right. It's about looking beyond that immediate gratification.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's area number 1, that understanding and directing those desires and aversions.
Right.
What's the second part of Epictetus's training program here?
So the second area is all about those impulses to act. So what is driving your decisions? Are you acting thoughtfully, based on reason, based on your values, or are you just kind of on autopilot, just reacting to those external triggers or those ingrained habits? So the real core thing here for you is to examine your motivations. Are you doing things for the right reasons, or are you being driven by fear, by anger, by some kind of obligation that you haven't really examined?
It's so easy to do that, isn't it?
It is. It is.
To react.
Because life is coming at you fast.
It is, yeah. And so what's that third key area that Epictetus highlighted?
So the third one is that crucial practice of thinking before you act.
Okay.
And this kind of reinforces that second point, right?
Right.
It's about creating that space, inserting that little pause between an external event, something happens to you, or even an internal impulse, and your response. And the key takeaway here is that this moment of reflection allows you to choose your actions rather than being controlled by your reactions.
It's being deliberate, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, and this idea of pausing, reflecting, it really connects to another core Stoic principle. Focusing on the present moment.
Absolutely.
And it's so easy to get lost in our heads, isn't it?
It is.
Our sources, they give these really relatable examples like, what should I wear? Do other people like me? What am I going to do with my life?
Right. Constant mental chatter. It is, yeah. And we waste so much energy dwelling on the past or worrying about the future that we completely miss what's happening right now.
Right here, right now.
Right here, right now.
Mm.
And our sources bring in this really interesting modern parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Belichick's famous do your job thing that he
Mm-hmm.
tells his players,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that's all about focusing on the task at hand. It's like that Roman soldier on the battlefield or the craftsman in the workshop. You cut through all the noise
Mm-hmm.
and all that anxiety about stuff that's outside of your control.
Yeah, focus on what you can control.
Yeah, and imagine, the listener, just how much mental space you would free up
Yeah.
if you just intentionally reduced your engagement with all those things, right?
Yeah.
The news, social media. How much more present could you be if you weren't constantly, like, reacting to those potential future problems that might not even happen?
Mm-hmm. It's such a drain.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And this leads to this other interesting idea, which is almost approaching philosophy as medicine for the soul. Now, Marcus Aurelius, he encourages us to approach philosophy, not like some harsh taskmaster,
No.
but as a source of comfort, of healing, like a patient seeking relief, right?
Yeah.
You're applying a soothing balm to a burn or a bandage to a wound.
Yeah.
You know, you're looking to philosophy for that kind of relief and care.
Yeah. It's practical. It's grounded.
Yeah, it's not just this abstract intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're approaching it like medicine, what is the cure that it offers?
Well, I think the cure is really learning to live in accordance with reason, not to be showy about it or to do it for anyone's approval but your own.
Mm-hmm.
It's about internalizing these principles so that they guide your actions naturally without you having to constantly, put on a performance
Right.
or try to get validation from other people.
Yeah, right. So it becomes who you are.
It does. And it circles back to what you were talking about earlier about controlling those impulses, like training a dog to obey.
Right.
It's that process of consciously choosing to respond in a certain way based on reason, based on understanding.
Yeah, it's building up that muscle.
It is.
Okay, so we're aiming for this inner peace through reason.
Mm-hmm.
But life happens, right? We face curveballs, those difficult circumstances that we didn't ask for.
Yeah.
So how does Stoicism help us when we're actually going through those times?
It's interesting. Stoicism doesn't say go out and actively seek out the hard stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Seneca, in our sources, actually disagrees with the folks who say that you should intentionally throw yourself into these really tough situations. The wise person, they'll endure those difficulties if they come up, but they're not going to actively choose them.
Okay.
The preference is for a life of peace, a life of tranquility, not constant battle.
So it's not about masochism. It's not about seeking out suffering.
No, not at all.
It's about being prepared for when those things come up.
It is. It's about developing that resilience.
Okay.
To handle life's inevitable challenges while still valuing peace of mind.
That might surprise some people who think that Stoicism is all about just
gritting your teeth and bearing it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, they also caution against, relying on negative emotions like anger to be your motivator.
Yeah.
Even though they acknowledge in our sources that anger can sometimes give you a temporary burst of energy.
Sure.
Of drive.
Absolutely. But I think that's a really important distinction to make.
Okay.
While anger might give you that short-term push, it's not sustainable in the long run, and it creates a lot of collateral damage along the way.
Right.
It clouds our judgment, it damages our relationships, and it wears us down emotionally. It makes me think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote where he says, "Hate is too great a burden to bear, even in the face of immense injustice."
Wow.
Right. And I think it speaks to that truth that while anger can feel really powerful in the moment, it's ultimately a destructive fuel. It's unsustainable. It's like burning your house down to stay warm.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes sense. And our sources, they tie this idea of not seeking strife to the development of your inner character.
Yeah.
They even ask this question, and I'm going to ask it to you, the listener. Tyrant or king?
Ooh.
Hero or Nero? Which will you be?
That's a good one.
It's a really powerful question.
It is.
Because it gets to the heart of how we choose to respond to those challenges.
Yeah, your response to adversity reveals your character.
Right.
It really does.
Yeah. Okay, so to safeguard that inner peace and to develop the character that we're aiming for, the Stoics, they really emphasize guarding our perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Aurelius, he urges us to be constantly vigilant about what we let into our minds. He says that what we are protecting is our integrity, our trustworthiness, our inner stability, our peace of mind, our freedom from unnecessary pain and fear, ultimately, our very freedom.
Yeah, it's a high-stakes game.
It is, it is. And it really highlights the importance of being mindful of what we allow to affect us. And our sources share some really insightful anecdotes about just how futile worry can be. Raymond Chandler, he talked about that constant, anticipation of unease that he felt.
Mm.
And Thomas Jefferson, he had this great line about suffering from evils that never actually happen.
Oh, yeah.
And then Seneca just sums it up perfectly by saying, there is nothing more common than to dread things which never happen.
Yeah, and I think these stories really illustrate the Stoic practice of taking a step back
Right?
from your immediate anxieties and recognizing that a lot of the stuff that we worry about
Right.
is just not founded in reality.
Yeah, it's like waking up from a vivid nightmare and
Yeah.
realizing, oh, thank goodness that wasn't real.
It wasn't real.
And this idea of controlling our perceptions, it seems closely linked to this other idea of wanting very little.
Yeah.
In fact, our sources, they quote Diogenes, who said, "To need nothing is divine. To need very little is the nearest approach to the divine." And the idea is that if you don't need much,
Yeah.
you're practically invincible,
Yeah.
right? Nothing external can truly, touch you.
You're not easily swayed?
No, you're not reliant
No.
on those external things.
And I think it's not just about rejecting the obvious excesses, wealth, fame.
Right.
It's also about recognizing that even seemingly good desires, if they become all-consuming obsessions, can be destructive.
Yeah.
They use the example of Gatsby in The Great Gatsby, that relentless pursuit of, that green light across the bay. It ultimately destroyed him, right?
Wow.
And so I think Stoicism really encourages us to honestly examine those desires that we have.
Right.
And to ask ourselves, are these desires truly serving me, or are they controlling me?
Right. Are they my master?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
It is.
And this leads to another fundamental Stoic principle, which is this idea of understanding that external circumstances themselves are indifferent.
Yeah, they don't care about our opinions.
No, they don't. They just are. They just are. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that external events, they have no power to provoke anger or distress within us because on their own, they're neutral. They're not like sentient beings that are trying to harm us.
They don't have an agenda.
No. And so the big takeaway for you, the listener, is that getting all emotionally worked up about stuff outside of your control doesn't actually change those circumstances. It only messes up your own inner state.
It robs you of your peace.
It does. And it's almost a harsh reality check, isn't it? Like our little emotional reactions don't change the facts on the ground.
Right.
So what does matter, according to the Stoics, is where we direct our attention and how we choose to respond when things go wrong. They make this point that the real source of harm isn't the person who wronged us. It's actually our own judgment and interpretation of that wrong.
Our opinion about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so crucial, because when someone does something that we perceive as wrong or that upsets us, it's really our own opinion,
Right.
our own interpretation of their actions that's fueling our anger, our frustration. The Stoic approach is to consciously resist being swept away by those initial knee-jerk emotional responses, and to give yourself the time and space to respond with self-mastery. And, the big takeaway here is that you have the power to choose how you respond to those external events, and that is where your strength lies.
Absolutely. So taking full responsibility for your reaction.
Yes.
And speaking of those reactions, our sources, they talk about just how fleeting both fame and anger are, the grand scheme of things. Marcus Aurelius, he reflects on how quickly even these really super famous figures of the past are forgotten. All their accomplishments just become smoke and dust.
Right. It's humble.
It is, isn't it? So it's a good reminder that both those external things that we chase after and our internal anger, it's all kind of temporary.
It's transient, it's passing.
Yeah.
And I think it encourages us to maintain perspective, especially when things are really heated. Think back to the last time you really blew up or held onto a grudge for a long time. Did it actually achieve anything positive?
Right.
Was there a resolution? Was there a benefit that came from it? Likely not. And I think the big takeaway for you is that both external praise and internal anger, they're both fleeting. And they don't actually define your worth.
Your true worth.
For your well-being.
It's a good reminder. And a key to navigating those fleeting experiences seems to be this idea of cultivating indifference towards things that are outside of your control. Our sources, they lay out this Stoic concept of good, which is virtue, bad, which is vice,
Mm-hmm.
and then everything else, those indifferent things, which include things like wealth, health, even life and death, pleasure and pain.
Right. They're not inherently good or bad in and of themselves.
Right.
It's how we use them and, more importantly, how we react to them. Epictetus even offers this reassurance. He says that even when you experience loss, something that you really value is taken from you, your capacity for reason and your ability to maintain your inner composure, those things remain untouched.
Okay.
Those things can't be taken from you. And that's really the core of our Stoic training.
Okay, so focusing on what you can influence,
Yeah.
your thoughts, your actions,
Yeah.
rather than getting pulled around by those external things that are ultimately outside of your grasp.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that means consciously deciding to let go of some of your desires. The sources use this really vivid analogy of a child with a goodie jar,
Oh, yeah, I like this one.
and they can't get their fist out of the jar.
Because they're grabbing too many treats.
They're holding on to too many treats.
Yeah.
So the wisdom there is to let go of a few of those treats so you can free your hand and maybe get something even better later on. And so in the same way, curbing those excessive desires allows you to obtain what you truly need for a good life.
Absolutely. And this also highlights the importance of, having an accurate assessment of yourself, of what you're actually capable of.
Right.
Not inflating your abilities, but also not selling yourself short.
Right.
And so the real challenge for you, the listener, is to identify those traits. What are those unnecessary desires that you're holding on to that are preventing you from that greater freedom, that greater fulfillment?
Yeah, it's that image of the goodie jar. It's deceptively powerful.
It is.
It really is. What are those things that we're holding on to? And this idea of letting go, of curbing desire, it connects to this other concept of achieving inner unity. The sources talk about this need to strive to be a unified human being,
Right.
where your actions and your thoughts are consistently aligned
Yeah, congruent.
with your reason,
Yeah.
rather than being pulled in all these different directions
Yeah.
by external pressures
Yeah.
or those fleeting desires.
And it makes me think about, how much of our time and energy do we just waste on these things that are ultimately meaningless?
Yeah.
Actions that are driven by vanity, wanting to impress people, following these unquestioned societal norms. Seneca even said, no slavery is more disgraceful than one which is self-imposed.
Wow.
And it makes you think, like, how much are we our own worst enemy?
Right. So it's really about taking stock, isn't it?
It is.
And examining, where's your energy going?
Yeah.
And are you living a life that's congruent with your values?
Absolutely.
Okay. And just as we, instinctively protect our physical well-being, the Stoics, they highlight this need to protect your mind.
Yes.
They say that we're often far more diligent about guarding our physical bodies than we are about being selective about what we allow to enter our minds. That constant stream of social media,
Yeah.
TV, other people's opinions, it's like we're just letting all this stuff in. Undiscriminatedly. Yeah.
And that's a constant challenge, especially in the world that we live in today with all the digital stimulation.
It is.
You might sit down to do some work and then you find yourself, 3 hours later, you're down some internet rabbit hole.
Yeah.
You might be physically present with loved ones,
Right.
but mentally you're miles away scrolling through your phone.
Oh, yeah.
You might be in a beautiful, serene place, but internally you're judging everyone around you, right? Epictetus actually said, above all, keep a close watch on this, that you are not carried away by the impression and beguiled. Hold fast to this. This is no business of mine.
Okay. So be really picky about what you let in.
Be picky, yeah, and be disciplined.
And the people we choose to be around, they have a huge impact on what gets into our minds too, don't they?
They do.
Our sources, they quote this really powerful trio. Jim Rohn, James Altucher, and Goethe. All of them emphasizing this idea of the importance of your associations. Goethe had this great line, tell me with whom you consort, and I will tell you who you are.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to that, fundamental truth about human nature. We tend to become like the people that we spend the most time with. Their habits, their attitudes, even their values start to rub off on us.
Right.
So Stoicism really encourages us to be conscious of that. Who's in your inner circle? Are these folks helping you to grow? Are they challenging you in a positive way, inspiring you to be better? Or are they dragging you down? Are they encouraging those bad habits, fostering a sense of stagnation?
It's a big question to ask.
It is, and you want to be deliberate about it.
Absolutely. Now, when we encounter people who are doing things that we, don't understand, we might even consider wrong, Stoicism has a really helpful perspective. It goes back to Socrates' idea that nobody does wrong willingly.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So from their perspective, however misguided it might seem to us, people are generally acting in ways that they believe are justified
Yeah.
or they believe will lead to some kind of positive outcome.
Right. They're acting according to their own logic, however flawed it might be.
Yeah.
And, in the sources, they bring up the example of those Confederate soldiers acting out of what they perceived as, simple obedience to duty.
Right.
And then Lincoln's call to dare to do our duty as we understand it.
Okay. So everyone's acting according to their own understanding
And it's right.
of what's right.
However mistaken it might be.
But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily intentionally doing something bad.
Right, exactly. And I think that understanding allows for more empathy and less judgment.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's a more generous interpretation, isn't it?
It is.
On the other hand, the sources also warn us about self-deception
Yes.
and its dangers.
Yes, the internal saboteur.
Yeah. Yeah. And self-deception, they say, is a major obstacle to personal growth and to wisdom. Zeno actually said that nothing is more hostile to a firm grasp of knowledge than self-deception.
Mm-hmm. It blinds us.
Yeah, our ego, it keeps us from seeing our own flaws and from learning from our mistakes. And Epictetus was pretty blunt about it. He said, it is impossible for a man to begin.